So welcome to our session. This is Writing and Learning in General Education. I am Liane Robertson from William Paterson University in New Jersey. Irene Clark from Cal State Northridge. Kathleen Yancey from Florida State. Taczak from the University of Denver. And Linda Adler-Kassner from UC Santa Barbara. Our session today is a roundtable, so we're going to give you...
As you can tell.
Yeah. Right.
Sorry.
It's more of a camp meeting, actually, but no. So it's a roundtable, so we're going to give brief presentations, and then we'll engage you all in discussion. So as a group, these are the questions we've been thinking about for a bit, actually, for a couple of years. And the Elon Research Seminar, we've all been part of that, and it's given us an opportunity to think about them in relation to one another. So we're going to relate them a little bit here today. So as I said, we'll each talk for about 7 minutes. We'll kind of gloss over the salient points. There's going to be a lot we're not saying, so if you have questions, we'll do that at the end. But we're going to put up our questions for you at the end of all this so that we have some discussion points, and then we'll have time to come back together. Okay? So Irene will start us off.
Hey.
All right. Musical chair.
Okay, I came to the study of transfer through my interest in genre. And I came to my interest in genre because I was teaching in Holland PhD students in the field of geography who were supposed to take my class in order to write a publishable article in English. And I discovered that my students didn't have any trouble with English. What they had trouble with was the genre of, can people hear me? What people had trouble with was the genre of academic writing and what an academic article in the field of geography was supposed to be. Even though these were the elite of the academic world, they don't take just anybody into PhD programs in Holland, and their English was excellent, and they had read all the literature, and they still didn't know. And I came upon John Swale's work about the rhetorical moves, and I showed them how to do that. And lo and behold, everything improved. Because when they didn't know that, all they had was a lot of information that they dumped into a text. And it wasn't what it was supposed to be. So then I came back and discovered that my freshmen and my graduate students and my upper division students and pretty much everybody, even my husband, had the same problem. Yeah, had exactly the same problem. And so I have been a genre enthusiast ever since, and when I came to the transfer workshop here, I was able to move some of the work I had been doing and do some new work, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today, very briefly, because I hear that I have very little time. Okay. So, the underlying assumptions of the study that I undertook, and it's now in its second year, were these. That when students learn to view a text in terms of its rhetorical and social purpose, when students are able to abstract principles from one rhetorical situation and apply them to another, I'm not saying how you do this, but when they can, when these insights are accompanied by a growing sense of confidence in their writing ability, and that's something that I have come to just recently, then they will be able to address new writing situations more effectively. So, what have I been doing with my time away from Elon? I gave out beginning surveys in 5 classes, and these beginning surveys asked students, what genres of writing are you familiar with when you come to the university? And I had a lot of choices for them. I asked them what terms and concepts associated with writing, rhetorical terms such as audience, rhetoric, rhetorical situation, ethos, pathos, logos, those terms, are you familiar with? And this one is the most interesting, I think, or one of them. What genres of writing do you predict will be most useful for you when you come to the university? What activities do you do? How much anxiety do you have about writing? And how do you view yourself as a writer? Now, I have 3 points in which we did surveys, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about very briefly. Okay. I hope you can see this. There were 3 points early in the semester when they first came to the university. What did they predict? Then after the first semester, and then after the second semester. So I distributed surveys in 5 classes, and if you look at the ends, they're not, as always, there are way more students in the beginning than there are at the end, and that's unfortunate, but there's not much I can do about that. Maybe I could go to their houses or something, but some of them dropped the course, one class was canceled, there are all these things. Okay, what was the most surprising, I think, was that at the beginning, before they came, before they even had the writing class, everybody said that the 5-paragraph essay would be really useful for them. And of course, we all smiled to ourselves and said, oh, wait till I finish taking our writing classes, because we always tell them, no 5-paragraph essay. And then at the end of the first semester, we asked them, well, what genre has been most useful for you at the university? And guess what? The 5-paragraph essay has increased. And at the end of the second semester, it is even higher. And that's something that we can talk about. I was surprised, but in a way I'm not surprised, because first of all, it isn't what you think. The students say they use the 5-paragraph essay, but they're not using it formulaically, and I'm getting that from the interviews. They're saying they're using that as a way of getting started with something, and then they make modifications. So it's not as bad as you think, but it did surprise me at first. And then you have personal narrative. I didn't think they were going to be writing too many personal narratives at the university, but apparently they are. Okay, and then you have the research paper, which they did predict was going to be useful, and it's pretty much a useful genre. It declined a little because people don't necessarily call what they assign a research paper. I think some of this has to do with terminology, but that was predictable. And then you have argument, which was particularly useful for them they predicted it would be useful. It was useful for them in the first semester. In the second semester, it was less useful, and I understand that too, because a lot of them are taking a 2-semester writing class, and the second semester is blogs and websites and not formal argument in the way you might think. Okay, so I understand all this, which is always best when you understand your data. Okay, the terms that they were familiar with, rhetoric, they were not that familiar, but they found it useful in both semesters. Rhetorical situation, they didn't know it, but they found it useful. Audience, they knew and found it useful. And the idea of a thesis, not surprisingly, they thought that was, they predicted that would be a useful concept. They were familiar with it, and it did turn out to be so. Okay, more of these concepts. Logos, ethos, pathos, genre, and counter-argument. You can see that they were least familiar with ethos. And interestingly enough, this is another one of these terms, in the subsequent interviews, which I'm still in the process of conducting, I asked students, remember you were taught these terms in your writing class? And they always remember audience, they remember logos, they remember rhetoric mostly. They hardly ever can remember what ethos is. So I think we should start calling it something else. because they do know what it is, they just don't know what it's called. Okay, now this is the most interesting, I think. The anxiety and the self-rating as a writer. What you can see here is although it's not super increased, their self-rating as a writer increased over the 2 semesters. And I think that's wonderful. And their writing anxiety decreased over the 2 semesters, which again is not a surprising result, but I do think that if they are going to undertake the metacognitive work that's necessary for transfer to occur, they have to feel confident enough about their own perceptions of things and that they know what they're doing. So if we are managing to give them a sense of confidence, and hopefully it's not an unwarranted sense of confidence, then I think that might be a way for transfer to occur. And what do you think? I did it, Maine.
You did it right on time.
Right on the duck. Okay. So, for the past several years, I have looked at the role that content plays in transfer, specifically the content of first-year comp, and how it transfers or does not transfer to other college writing contexts. So how does what we teach in first year comp prepare students for writing in gen ed and beyond? Sometimes faculty outside and even inside of our field assume that first year comp courses are comprised of a kind of representative writing, but in fact research and experience tell us it's not universal. It's not the lab report that students compile in the sciences, it's not the problem solution oriented writing that students produce in writing for business or engineering, and it doesn't align with the approaches to writing in an argument in history or criminal justice, for example. Writing is always situated, and no first year comp course can feature content that addresses every writing situation. But a first year comp course can feature content that fosters transfer, content designed to help students successfully approach the writing they'll find in each content. So which content will do that is the question. That is the question my research started with and which it continues to try to answer. So several years ago I began to look at different types of content featured in first year comp, comparing them. Specifically, which content might transfer best to other contexts. So I conducted this initial study in 2009, 2010 at Florida State over 2 semesters, and it compared the content of 3 different first year comp sections and the transfer that occurred from those first year comp courses to gen ed courses or courses in the disciplines after the second semester. Featured a total of 7 subjects, 2 in one, 2 in the next, and 3 in the last of the 3 different first year comp sections. One section was themed around media and culture, one was an expressivist design, and the third was a teaching for transfer design, which Taczak and I designed for each of our studies. Kara's going to talk about her work in a minute. And that teaching for transfer section was focused on writing concepts through a set of key terms and a set of reiterative reflection assignments that connect writing theory to practice throughout the semester. During the first semester, while students were enrolled in a first year comp course, the study looked at the content students were focused on in each of those 3 sections and whether they could identify concepts taught or learned in the course and apply them to subsequent assignments. When students moved into the second semester, they were asked to interpret and outline an approach to the writing requirements they faced in those contexts. The study sought to determine whether there is evidence of transfer and whether it can be attributed to the particular content taught in each of the sections of first year comp in the study. So I've extended that initial study to a larger 3-year study, comparing content taught in different sections as I did in the first study, but also now comparing across contexts. So across institutions primarily, but also across contexts of delivery, so traditional versus online, across different student populations at these various institutions, so looking at attitudes, dispositions, expectations, identity, all of that. So while my current study extends that original scope some, the findings from it, which are very preliminary at this point, since I just began, they so far echo the findings of the first study in many ways, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. So first, content that will allow students to transfer knowledge must be specifically designed to that end. We can't assume that any content will transfer. When we teach literature as content, it often mirrors the high school writing experience. So they see college writing as familiar or no different than high school writing and can mistakenly believe this type of writing to be applicable in any situation. When we feature themed content, we hope to engage students by offering a compelling theme, but the theme is what they take up as knowledge from the course. If we want them to transfer knowledge about writing, the content needs to be writing. Writing concepts are key terms that students read about, identify, define, discuss, and write about. Secondly, when content is not explicit, students fill that void with prior knowledge, often from their previous context of high school, as I mentioned. This prior knowledge can be a barrier to learning because it contributes to the perpetuated understanding that writing is something already learned. Therefore, new or greater knowledge is not necessary. And because literature content often taught in high school is familiar to students, if they see it in the first year comp class, they can develop a false sense of expertise about writing. So their prior knowledge impedes the new learning. When a first year comp course does not look familiar, the burden of prior knowledge is more easily released. Students can better see themselves as novices and be therefore open to new learning. So they write themselves into expertise, as Summers and Saltz suggest. You're going to hear more about prior knowledge in a second. A third finding relates to content that includes a variety of writing samples or writing process, but that is not explicit. Content might be designed to explore and demonstrate writing in multiple ways, but it's not based in writing concepts. We might assume that process writing is content, that doing writing will suffice as content, or that as long as writing occurs, content is inconsequential. But transfer requires, as we know from Beaufort and others, a conceptual framework. Writing process did transfer for my study participants. Some vowed to use multiple drafts or reverse outlines in the future. But that's writing strategy. It's not conceptual knowledge that will transfer. When we teach writing concepts and practice about writing as content and deliberately explain that the goal of that course is transfer, students look for opportunities to achieve that goal. When they understand that transfer is what they want, they're planning to transfer as they're learning about writing, so even before they get to the next context. When students understand writing content as both theory and practice, and content that is explicit so they don't feel the need to substitute prior knowledge for indiscernible content, they also need a vocabulary with which to articulate writing as content, as they do in other disciplines. When the content is designed to transfer, here's one example of what can result. You can read that. Student went to a psych class and had some success with transfer. I would read it for you, but I can't see it. Yeah, never mind. So lately, my ongoing research has me asking another question about content. How is content situated in first-year comp? So in other disciplines, courses are built around explicit subject matter. For example, a history course that focuses on the civil rights era is not themed, but situated. Another example is a literature course focusing on the works of, say, Jane Austen or in 20th century America. In those courses, the content is history. The content is literature. If we were to think of college writing or first-year comp as situated rather than themed, where would we situate it? Would we situate it in the study of genre, for example? Would we situate it in maybe workplace writing or school writing for school? Or around threshold concepts, maybe, which Linda's going to talk more about? Or would we still situate first-year content around writing about something other than writing? This is my latest content question, one of a gazillion. But how might we think of content and first-year comp as situated? That's what I'm working with now.
So now I am also going to trip the light. Fantastic. And what that means is that I have much more to say than I can get through in 8 minutes, so you're lucky. Happy to take questions afterwards. My task here is to dial back, and you heard Liane forecast that, to think a little bit with you today about prior knowledge. And in the spirit of Wegner, I'm thinking in terms of mapping the landscape of prior knowledge. And I'll say at the outset that I think it's a lot more than knowledge. Now, I think we know that, but I'm prepared to demonstrate for you, at least in part, what that prior consists of. That's part one. Part two is to make the argument that when we synthesize work along any dimension of transfer, it allows us to begin to create frameworks and prototypes that have value, at least in terms of our heuristic and helping us raise other research questions. I'm going to show you one such framework. And then third but not least, I want to show you a little bit of a case study where I use some of the language that Kara and Liane and I, Lara is the blend, have worked on. And the idea is, or the question is, if we take what we've learned about transfer and share it with students, will that help them understand their own development as writers? That's one question. And the second is, from a research angle, what might we learn in the process? So that's the task today. If there were time, I would give you much more delineation, simply to say that the school contexts invite many uses of what I am calling the prior. So processes, we know, I've got several references, though not all of them. The extracurricular is pretty interesting. There was a student that we looked at who was overly fond of argument as a consequence of his successful high school debate experience. So we haven't looked very much at that, but clearly that plays a role. We coined an expression called absent prior knowledge, but we're not the only ones who have talked about the phenomenon, as you can see from the reference. And the idea is that students come to us not knowing something that actually they need to know. For instance, experience with nonfiction texts. Dispositions, there's a lot of good work that's been done on that. I'll simply point out that the unit of analysis for disposition really ranges rather widely, from the individual as the unit of analysis to the school system as the unit of analysis. So it's really important to operationalize the term. Another expression that Lara and I came up with is point of departure. That's Karen Liane. And there we're referring to students' sense of writerly self based on external markers like testing and grades. It was remarkable how many students were unable to move forward unless and until they come to terms with that particular point of departure. Beliefs, Jeff Summers has a wonderful article in the Journal of Basic Writing, 2011, that looks at his invitation to students to think about the beliefs about writing that they bring in the class with them and how those beliefs change or do not over the course of the term. That's an area that we haven't really folded into the transfer research, but that clearly merits attention. Knowledge, I won't speak to because I think that's a foregone conclusion. And we just heard about anxiety and affect more generally, and we heard about affect yesterday as well. That's before we get to out-of-school context. And we know that out-of-school context, whether they're in the personal domain, in the workplace domain, or in the civic domain, influence what students will do with writing as well. So we've heard about processes. Again, we've heard about dispositions. There's a very nice article in the June issue of C's that you might want to take a look at. It's 2 students who are community college students who've been in the workplace and who are coming back to school, and their experiences are, Doppel in particular is pretty interesting. That's the name of the student. Point of departure, Matt Davis has a dissertation that speaks to that, again, from someone's blogging experience. A student who was a self-appointed review editor of a blog and learned a lot in the process that was both good news and bad news, and then knowledge. So if you put all of this together and you start to map what we might be seeing here, and you put together Elizabeth Wardle's observations in the introduction to the special issue of Forum on Transfer about the role of habitus in framing and shaping students' experiences. So on the one hand, students enter college coming in as problem explorers or problem solvers. Solvers being people who are more conservative and basically trying to fill the very basic rudimentary tasks that's given to them. Explorers being more flexible. If you put that together with the work that Reef and Borwarshi have done, looking again at boundary guarders and boundary crossers, again, you've got willing to explore and not. And then what we looked at in the Comp Forum issue when we talked about students' use of prior knowledge, and we posited 2 uses. Assemblage being a model, think of Picasso in MoMA, where there's a structure and a model already in place. Students will take 1 or 2 info bits of the new learning and simply graft it on the old model. The old model, in fact, does not change. And you contrast that with remix, which is a situation where people take new knowledge, old knowledge, and usually personal values, and make a new model out of it. So if you put those together, then you begin to have a typology, or what we're calling a typology of students entering college writing scenes. Now, you can see their conceptual poles. There's obviously a lot in the middle, but that at least has some heuristic value for helping us think a little bit about the prior. It's also the case that this makes a lot invisible. Let me show you an example. So this is obviously a scratch piece of paper. I'd taken my little typology box and started to map out what was not apparent in that typology. Let me give you 2 examples of things that might be worth exploring, and this is part of the utility of this. One is the term assemblage is just remarkably interesting in terms of the way it's being used both in the transfer research and elsewhere. So one is we used it to talk about a student's model of composing. If you know the work of John and Johnsonola and Stuart Selber in Computers and Composition, they talk about assemblage as a composing process in digital environments. And then if you look at Michael Michaud's work, he's got several articles in TETYC, and he talks about students at the community college, one of whom talks about his assemblage model as right-click stealing, okay, which is pretty interesting. So you've got assemblage doing a lot of work here, but again, we'll have to disambiguate what that means. So there's something promising there that wants to be explored. A second point, I think, that of exploration, potential information, when you look at the literature, it's just astonishing how many students in middle school learn something that they bring with them to college. I don't know why middle school shows up so much. It's really, really interesting. So I've got 2 possible theories, and you no doubt will have more. One is that there's a developmental moment in middle school where that's simply opportune for students to make some meaning that they can carry forward. The second is that if you look at the curriculum in middle school, it's more interdisciplinary than any other curriculum they're going to have, right? It's certainly more than high school and college, and it's more than most elementary schools. And it may be that very interdisciplinarity creates a moment for concurrent transfer that helps them solidify their gains. So, things to think about. Last point, Nicole. So I took the language, remix, and assemblage, and in a 2-hour document-based interview with Nicole, basically asked her about the utility of these terms. 3 interesting points. One is that I didn't have to explain the terms to her. They have enough cultural salience that she knew the terms, and that says something about the vocabulary that we want to use, I would suggest. Second is that regarding assemblage, and echoing Irene's point, she said, in fact, that assemblage, in fact, describes some of her writing. Now, she was a double major, editing, writing, and media, and a classics major, and she said that basically she had used an assemblage model throughout her entire college career, that in some ways described the model of writing that she operated off of. But when I asked her about remix, she said she was remix. And she told a story about being in an AP English class in high school where she had wanted to bring her own personal insights and creativity into the assignment, and the teacher told her that she could not. And somewhat like Scarlett O'Hara, she vowed never to let that get in her way again. And she made a commitment so that every school task that came her way was going to have a part of Nicole. This was really interesting to me. Are there other such moments that students experience? And if so, what do they make of them? So what does this all mean? Well, first of all, the prior is extraordinarily complex, and it's a lot more than knowledge. So finding some way, second, to bring all that prior from the multiple sites together into some sort of coherent map of the landscape would be extraordinarily useful for all of us. The third is, if all else fails, you've got something you don't like, so you can resist it and rebuild and make it better. And then fourth, and from my point of view best, students are obviously the source of the research, and they can help us go even further. Thanks very much.
Hello, I'm one half Alera. And I'm going to really be picking up where Liane and Kathy just left off, talking a lot about prior knowledge, specifically in relationship to the course that Liane and I co-designed. And I'm going to give you, because I only have maybe 6 minutes, we'll see how fast I can go. I'm going to give you a quick preview about this research and quickly generalize some of the conclusions from 2 qualitative studies. Wrong button. Okay. And you can see the 2 questions that I asked. I won't read them to you, but they were in a line with the Elon research seminar. So for the first study, building on my previous research, my first study used the Teaching for Transfer model, or TFT, that Liane and I created for our research from Florida State. And this is our model, basically. The key terms, reflective framework, students' development of theory writing. Hopefully this means that they're going to transfer. So there are two main findings that I want to focus on really quickly from this study. The first, students are able to develop a theory of writing based on prior knowledge and new knowledge that they use to frame and reframe writing situations, both inside the composition course and outside the composition course. One way that the TFT course asks students to tap into their prior knowledge is through the creation of the theory of writing. And this is something that students pick up on. As one student stated, quote, "In high school, there were no guidelines. So what I came into the classroom with was my own personal views of writing. Now, my theory of writing is my specific set of guidelines that help me write. The theory of writing, as defined by my 9 participants, gives students the opportunity to bridge prior knowledge about writing to their new knowledge about writing in ways that does not discount what they've learned previously, but also asks them to keep moving forward in their understanding of writing." And here we have some quick examples. These are 3 of my participants' theories of writing 1 year later. So a year, about 15 months after I originally interviewed them, after they had taken the TFT course, this is their response to what their theory of writing is. And you can see how they're trying to grapple with both prior knowledge and the knowledge they learned in the course. And the second finding relates to this, that teaching explicitly for transfer, students begin to make the connections themselves about the importance of transfer. And we can see this in their theory of writing as they're trying to make sense of both knowledges in different contexts. Alexa discussed this in her follow-up interview when she said, quote, "I think when I took your class and after the first assignment, it wasn't like an aha moment, like I get it now, but it was a moment where I began to understand that writing could be done in a different way because I had never been asked to do writing like that. I think the class made me able to focus on why I'm writing, how I'm writing better, and also gave me a reason to write instead of just blah, 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 blahing about stuff as I did before." her words. My second study, moving quickly along to my second study, a lot of my research has centered on reflection's relationship to transfer, and I wanted to see how, if at all possible, the TFT's reflective framework could function inside a themed course. This actually came from one time Les Perlman asked in a session, why can't we teach themes? I think we should be able to teach themes, and Kathy had a really great answer, and I was like, why can't we teach themes? And so I wanted to see if this was possible. And so the instructor, you see her class, the big theme was sustainability, argumentation, rhetorical situation with the reflective framework. This study just concluded this month, so I have very preliminary findings. The first, which is we've already heard, prior knowledge matters to students. And this is true for several reasons. First, when students are asked to develop a set of key terms, they often return to their prior knowledge. This is especially important for theme-based courses. When students are not given a writing content to learn from, what they learn is dependent upon the content of the course, which, as Liane mentioned, is most often not writing. The participants struggle with defining key terms, using prior knowledge to help them out, and often the prior knowledge conflicted with or was absent from the actual definition of the term. Second, and connecting to this first point, when reflection is not taught in intentional, deliberate, and systematic ways, students don't generate an understanding of key terms, but they do develop an awareness, which means they can remember them, but they aren't really sure what they mean to themselves as writers or to the writing practices. And last, reflection merges into this muddy thing of, kind of being able to look back on my life, not really look back on my writing practices. My second preliminary finding is that prior knowledge matters to instructors. And when I say this, I mean our own prior knowledge with writing in our classroom. The instructor who taught this course, Marjorie, believed that she already used reflection in her classroom. Before incorporating the reflective framework, she said, quote, "I think before this quarter, I did use a lot of reflection. So I always have them reflect on their papers before they turn them in." And she was highly skeptical of using the entire framework as part of her class. For example, in response to using an article on reflection in the class, she said, quote, "I felt there would be some resistance from the reading, mostly because I was thinking about how I would react if I was a freshman. I wouldn't have known what they were talking about." So Marjorie's own prior knowledge was a roadblock as she anticipated the students resisting, and possibly as a result, she didn't teach the reflective theory piece in the most meaningful ways that she could. Second, what we do with our prior knowledge is important. Because Marjorie already believed she used reflection in the classroom, her focus wasn't necessarily on incorporating reflective practice in these intentional, systematic, deliberate ways. Her goal for any course, according to her, was to show that she was passionate about the subject matter. Her subject matter is sustainability. As we can see, and this slide here shows, her students didn't believe that they transferred, actually. Two of them said, one said, "Sadly, I realized that I didn't take as much from 1122 as I wanted. We did this to learn from what we've done." Another student, the good old favorite resistant student, said, "Like I said, I wouldn't necessarily say I learned anything new during my tenure at DU." He's a first-year student. "But rather, many ideas I learned in the class were solidified." So, interestingly, and a point that supports an earlier claim that Kathy, Liane, and I have made, is there was one student who did seem to transfer, but she was a student of a first-year student of mine that I had for our first-year seminar course, where I do focus on key rhetorical terms. I do have a reflective framework, and students do engage in some form of a theory. So she is my she's my yes, that's right student. So in conclusion, I think what this really shows us is that the terminology and language is pivotal, which we heard yesterday several times. And I think my two studies are pointing to, if we hope students to walk away being able to successfully frame new writing situations in meaningful and rhetorical ways, we must account for both students' prior knowledge and our prior knowledge so that we may be able to bridge them together.
We were going to sit like hockey players do and just move down one seat, but we decided not. I'm going to talk about the last question, which has to do with general education. And I will say that the work I'm going to talk about draws on surveys of students, some text-based interviews with students, and interviews with faculty. But because I'm me, I'm both going to speed talk and start very large, then go small, and then go back very large. So I'll sort of walk you through this. So the question that I'm addressing is, given what we know about learning and transfer, how can alternative theoretical frameworks help us to rethink general education? By alternative here, I'm referring to alternative to the ways that American educational institutions have thought about general education. Needless to say, in my 7 minutes, I cannot begin to discuss the entire history of general education. So what I will say is, from a 30,000-foot perspective, we can identify 3 purposes of general education that have been emphasized in different ways, shapes, and forms throughout the history of GE and the contemporary academy. They have focused on, these 3 things: cultivating liberal learning for the purpose of professional training, providing professional training that is grounded in liberal learning. So in other words, general education is always grounded in, for example, writing, communicative practice, critical thinking, quantitative reasoning. These are liberal learning strategies. That's why we hear about things like skills associated with professional success when we talk about general education. And finally, disciplinarity. In the midst of these outward-looking things, general education is also supposed to have something to do with introducing students to disciplines and perhaps discipline-based ways of thinking. In general education programs, there is presumed to be a sort of transfer among these points, as is represented on this slide, and I will say it is rarely well defined what exactly this kind of transfer is supposed to be. I don't have time to go into the complications of these 3 points, but 3 things are critical here. The meaning of professional training has shifted dramatically over the last 100 years. The meaning of liberal learning has not shifted at all. This shift has big implications for disciplinarity, which is becoming increasingly unimportant to people outside of the university, while it remains very important to those of us inside the university. And as general education has evolved, the relationships between what happens in it and context beyond, sometimes disciplines, often sites outside of the university, have become less than clear. This has left general education courses like writing open to critique, often expressed by others outside of the academy whose voices are far more powerful than ours, which is a point I'll come back to in a minute. This is a subject for another time. However, it is an exigency for why I think it's very important to think about remodeling or rethinking general education. So, from the presentations that my fine colleagues have given thus far, as well as many other folks at this conference, we know how transfer and transformation are currently conceived and how important they are for the development of learning. This slide includes some of my favorite passages from research examining a critical point related to transfer. The more explicit contexts for learning are, and the more we can immerse students in examination of structures of learning, the more likely it is that they will recognize both structure and variation, 2 key factors that are associated with transfer. In other words, if we want students to understand how to function in one community of practice, an idea I'll come back to in a moment, one way to do that is to help them look at what those communities of practice are and variation between and among them. So the remodeling framework that has emerged from the research I've been conducting from the Elon Transfer Seminar and beyond with my colleague John Majewski, who's a historian at UC Santa Barbara, extends from these ideas. In essence, it suggests that general education courses can provide both a framework and a variety of sites to study what we call communities of practice. So on this slide, I've defined communities of practice, which of course draws from Etienne Wenger and Jean Lave's work. In general education courses, students might study how communities of practice are constructed and what elements of functioning are critical for them. This ability to recognize boundaries and learn about learning practices is a set of strategies that travel across communities of practice, of course.
to use the language of policy discourse, this kind of ability and recognizing what constitutes a community of practice and how to learn inside of it can contribute to what is called college and career readiness. Because UC Santa Barbara, where I teach, is very focused on disciplinarity, Meyer and Land's threshold concepts have proven a very fruitful lens for students and faculty to approach thinking about communities of practice. And I've defined threshold concepts for you on this slide. We can come back to this. They are epistemological practices critical for participation in disciplines. And these are critical elements of communities of practice, especially in academic disciplines. So if we think about a discipline is in part defined because its members participate in shared threshold concepts. And if students learn to identify what these concepts are and then how to perform in them, they can both, and learn to identify that they're doing it, that can be a useful thing. So threshold concepts have particular features. They are troublesome, transformative, integrative, and irreversible, among other things. So the idea of general education as introduction to communities of practice is that through the content of the course and explicit attention to the practices associated with content, students learn about how knowledge is constructed and values within communities, and again, that there are differences between them. By interviewing faculty about threshold concepts in their disciplines, and by reworking our classes, that is John's history class, a giant 450-person general education history class, and my writing 2 class, a freshman comp class, so that they introduce and or ask students to investigate threshold concept, we found that this lens has, to borrow a term from Meyer and Land, has a transformative effect on students. And by interviewing faculty about threshold concepts in their discipline, they also experience a kind of transformative way of thinking about their discipline. Because in both of these cases, students and faculty make explicit and discover threshold concepts, and they start to see distinctions among communities of practice. So I'm going to put up a couple of examples. These come from some interviews with faculty that I've conducted. We found, as I said, that when we talk with students and faculty, but faculty here, they really experience some of the same stages that Meyer and Land address. And my favorite quote on this slide is the second one down. I was interviewing a colleague in the English department, and he was using these great metaphors to talk about text in freshman, sophomore level literature class. And he said, well, it's kind of text as machine and text as artifact. And I said, have you ever talked about, have you ever used these terms with students before? And he said, no, I never have. I've never used these terms until this moment. And it was just sort of like, wow, this is really interesting to me. And I just love that. So for faculty, it really is very transformative. And I can talk more about that. For students, as I said, my colleague John and I have sort of redesigned our first year courses to think about threshold concepts in our disciplines. So one that I work with in first year writing is that writing is a subject of study and an activity, and one that John works with is history consists of meaningful and competing narratives. And here on this very crammed slide, and I apologize, are some of the ways that we have done that. So in the first block, threshold concepts of writing studies, you can see an assignment that I gave to students in a first year writing class, and on the right-hand side, some of John's syllabus and some of the activities that he's provided in his class. So working from this perspective, and now I'm going to go back out again, has the potential to help students and faculty to rethink and reframe, which is really important, as Carmen and Donna and Paula talked about earlier today, what happens in teaching and learning. And this is what Etienne Wenger discussed yesterday. So again, zooming way back to Wenger's talk yesterday, Wenger was talking about the ideas of competence and knowledgeability, saying that the latter was concerned with identities within landscapes. He suggested knowledgeability existed along 2 axes, which I put on this slide. And this slide and this representation represents a sort of ideal and imaginary balance between networks, the practices generated among communities, and guidelines, the boundaries for practice. Right now, though, it looks something like this. Guidelines are far more powerful than networks. That's why we need to create what Wenger calls a transverse, something that sort of stretches between them, that attempts to restore a balance. And I think through this framework of general education as introduction to communities of practice, we can start to do that by focusing on the kinds of questions that are outlined in red on this slide. What are the boundaries of communities of practice? It helps, and then what results when we start looking at that? It can help us to restore some balance. So this is an idea that we're thinking about and playing with on my campus that's come out of this research, and I'm eager to hear folks' feedback on it. Thank you.